Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today, whether it's the few who could fit into our conference room here or the many who have joined us virtually. It's a great pleasure to have you here to look ahead and continue to prepare for hurricane season. My name is John Bravender. I'm the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the National Weather Service Central Pacific Hurricane Center. And I'll be introducing our speakers today. First on the agenda is Kevin Kodama, Senior Service Hydrologist, with the wet season summary and outlook for the dry season. Kevin?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks, John. So just get started, get right into it. So back in October of last year, we entered the wet season with severe to extreme drought in all of the counties in the state. And back then we just started a second year of La Nina. If you recall, back last summer, La Nina had ended, gone back into ENSO neutral territory, but then came right back in the fall, so that we ended up with a second year in a row of La Nina conditions. So with that backdrop for the climate, back in October, our wet season outlook called for above average rainfall, especially in the windward areas, the east-facing slopes of the state. And for Maui County and the Big Island, there was a chance that with the strength of the La Nina that we were going to see a persistence of drought in the leeward areas, because for the level of La Nina that we were expecting, we would anticipate more persistent trade winds than usual, and so that would mean more of the rainfall would just be on the east-facing slopes. So what ended up happening? It was a wild wet season, to say the least. We had a lot of extremes. We had a late start to the wet season. If you recall, back in October and November, overall, we had below average rainfall conditions, with the sole exception of the windward slopes of the Big Island. They had actually a wet October, and then they joined the rest of the state in November, and they had overall dry conditions. And then December rolled around, and December was very wet across the state. We had the big Kona low, and also later in December we had some low pressure systems come around, and so we ended up with very wet conditions statewide. And so that resulted in an elimination of drought across the entire state. And then right around January 3rd or so, the tap turned off, and it stayed that way all the way through March. And then only in April did we start to get our rainfall back. But again, because we're getting toward the tail end of the wet season, trade winds were persistent through the entire month of April. So even though conditions were wet, the rainfall mainly affected the windward sides of the state, and so the leeward areas stayed dry throughout April. And so we ended up, by the end of April, we had severe to extreme drought conditions on Oahu, Maui County, and then on the Big Island. So looking at the numbers, we ended up with the 12th driest wet season in the last 30 years. And most of the rain gauges, rainfall statistics or totals that we got showed average to below normal totals for the October through April time frame. And then there were some notable totals. Look at some of the outliers. You look at Honolulu Airport. Even though for the most part it was very dry, they got just under 18 inches of rainfall, which is right around 140% of average. But then when you look closer at the totals, 90% of that rainfall occurred in just 8 days, and the rest of the time it was very dry. So if you take away those 8 days, the total would have ended up less than 30% of average, so they would have fit in with most of the rest of the state. And you look at Lihue Airport, they had their 16th wet season in the last 30 years, and then Kahului and Hilo airports had their 10th driest wet seasons in the last 30 years. So what are we looking at going forward for the dry season, the May through September dry season? We're looking at probabilities favoring the continuation of La Nina all the way through the rest of this year. Some of the probabilities are short. Maybe there might be a short dip back into the cold side of ENSO neutral territory, but the bulk of the guidance is showing that we're going to see a persistence of La Nina conditions all the way through the rest of 2022. And so what that means is the climate forecast, looking at the consensus of our long-range models, and the Climate Prediction Center's forecast, we're looking at drier than average rainfall conditions for the state for the summer. And with the potential of a third year of La Nina conditions, that would mark only the third time in the last 50 years that we've had 3 La Niñas in a row. So with the forecast of below average rainfall expected for the summer, for the dry season, you can look for the existing drought areas that we already have in place to intensify and expand even further. And that will have a significant impact on the agriculture sector, especially for non-irrigated interests. So that's the ranching community especially. And for the wildfire season, we're looking at an earlier peak than what we would normally get. Usually the peak of the wildfire season is somewhere in late July to early August. And, we're looking to move that forward by, a month or two. So, maybe June timeframe even, we might see significant dryness and, starting to see potential for significant wildfire ignitions. Of course, the one exception to that will be Kauai. They have the least amount of drought going on right now, and if you look outside or you look at the weather forecast for this week, they could get significant rainfall, and so, they also have the least amount of drought, so that drought could go away by the end of this week, but looking at them to dry out, as we go forward, and so maybe, later in the summer, they're going to be in just as bad shape as the rest of the state. And so even the windward sides, with the overall drier than normal conditions, we could see maybe some moderate to severe drought in the windward sides in just some isolated areas. And the main impacts for those would be for water supplies that utilize surface water for their sources, and also those who are on water catchment. And that's all I had. Keep it real short and simple. On your media advisor and the handout that you should have, and it would also be posted online, there's some links to the wet season maps if you want some additional details on coverage and the statistics. So that's all I had, and back to you, John.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. And all of us will be available for questions afterwards. We'll go through each of the speakers and be able to answer any questions afterwards. So next on the agenda is the presentation of the Dr. Arthur Chu Hurricane Preparedness Award. Governor Ige wasn't able to make it due to a schedule conflict, but he wrote a letter of commendation to accompany this award. The award this year is being presented to Larry Konda, a retired Hayama employee, who unfortunately is also not able to join us here today. I'd like to read a portion of the commendation. The Dr. Arthur N.L. Chu Hurricane Preparedness Award recognizes an organization, business, or individual who has demonstrated excellence in hurricane preparedness throughout the state. It is named in honor of the late Dr. Arthur N.L. Chu, who was an engineering professor at UH Manoa for 42 years. Dr. Chu was internationally recognized for his expertise on the effects of winds on structures and was a longtime volunteer with the Hawaii State Hurricane Advisory Committee. I'm pleased to recognize Larry Konda as this year's recipient, honoring his years of service to the people of Hawaii. Larry's decades of work with the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency has helped our state become more resilient and more hurricane ready. Though his work has largely been behind the scenes, unseen and unsung, Larry has played a vital role in critical hazard mitigation projects throughout the state. On behalf of the state of Hawaii, a big mahalo to Larry for his work and service to the state and its people. With warmest regards, David Ige, Governor of Hawaii. Accepting the award on Larry's behalf is Luke Myers, Administrator of Hawaii Emergency Management Agency.
Thank you, John. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here on behalf of the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. This is my first time as administrator. It's been a long last couple of years actually being out of Diamond Head Crater. But Larry Konda is more than deserving for this award. Over 20 years ago, I was an intern for Larry in the State Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. When we think about hazard mitigation and the vulnerabilities that we face here in the state, we tend not to think about sheltering or food or water. We think about other things, including resiliency. Several big projects over the years that Larry has been part of, some most recently the Wilcox Generator Project, and several generator projects at the Matson Terminal. Also some Waikiki hardening for hurricanes at fire stations. Many of these projects are not as glamorous, and you may not know about them. They are more of capital facilities projects. But Larry has instilled the confidence in us all at HIEMA and our other partners in the true value of hazard mitigation. This infrastructure is important to you all in the public because whether it's blue skies or gray skies, there's a need out there for this infrastructure. I humbly accept this award on behalf of Larry, and I wish he could be here today. As we look outside, and it's great today, and I'm like a kid in the candy store today. We all have different sports seasons out there, but this is hurricane season, and we get to lead in the Central Pacific. But we have a challenge for you all here at State Emergency Management for the public. Steps that you can take to get ready. Every step we take as individuals, as residents, as visitors, as businesses here can make us more resilient and make us ready for anything. So there are 6 steps that I asked you all to take, either all of them or one. The first, know your hazards, where you live, work, and play. Things get wet, things get flood, and we have landslides. Those fun things that interrupt our daily lives. Second, sign up for emergency alerts. Where you live, work, and play. Each county has an alert system that you can sign up for that information. Third and fourth, refresh your kits and your plans and discuss those with your loved ones. 5, look at your insurance policies. A very cheap form of mitigation is flood insurance. Check with your insurance agent on that opportunity. And 6, consider a home retrofit for hurricane season. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and we ask everyone to be prepared. Thank you.
Our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Dennis Wong from University of Hawaii Sea Grant. Dennis?
Okay. Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by just showing a video. We showed this last year, but it's very instructive. I'd like to explain a little more about the details of this. Okay, you can see the roof lifting off, shingles coming off the roof, and the roof flying off. Okay. Okay, so that was in January 1991. You can say, hey, there was no hurricane or tropical storm. How could this happen? Well, what's happening is on that date, there was a cold front, and there were 22 to 30 mile per hour winds with gusts up to 50 miles per hour. And then right here, you see a topographic speed up map. This is in our Hawaii building code. Okay, so when you add the 50 mile per hour with the 40 mile per hour topographic speed up, you simulate a strong tropical storm or a weak hurricane. And that's what's happening for that one location on Oahu. Okay, so topographic speed up can convert this 20 to 30 mile per hour wind into something that could damage property. Imagine what it could do if a Category 1 or Category 2 occurs. Okay, so when there is a hurricane that's threatening us, the strong winds will not be just at one location, but for the entire island. And here you see Lane approaching Oahu from the south. Fortunately, it weakened and turned to the west. But if it actually hit as a Category 2 with topographic speed up, they estimate 52,000 households displaced. Displaced means that there's severe damage. Okay, $27 billion in damages. This is by a FEMA Hazards Tools study. Okay. And again, this is the type of damage that it could occur. The 2 pictures to the left are from Iniki with the roof flying off. That Manalani Heights is a reminder of what could happen with strong winds. And really, because of the potential damage to Oahu, we've been emphasizing this for over 10 years now. It's really important to tie your roof to the wall because this could prevent a lot of damage. It's not that difficult to do. A handy person could do it in 2 Saturdays. They should seek the advice of a licensed structural engineer or architect. and or they could hire a licensed contractor. Okay, and then these are just the different types of wall ties, hurricane clips tying the roof to the wall. Okay, so a lot of this is in the homeowner's handbook. You may not have seen the printed copy of it because it was printed just before COVID, and now we're here in person. But it's available online as a free PDF. We are working with the Hawaii Public Library System, and they're distributing it through their 51 libraries around the state. And the book covers multi-hazard risk and some of the key things to prepare that Luke mentioned. Have your emergency supplies, your evacuation kit. Know your evacuation plans. Very important to know if you're in a flood zone, a storm surge zone, or if your house is strong enough for the wind. Okay? And then some home retrofit measures, the simplest being, and the first one we recommend is tying your roof to the wall. Then here's some other measures for window protection and so on. There's also information on financial incentives to retrofit and insurance for flood and wind. We'd like to mention again that we're working with the Hawaii Public Library System. In the last few months, we've delivered 45 boxes of books to their 51 public libraries, or they have. And on May 27th, there'll be a free webinar open to the public. You do need to register. It'll explain a little bit about the book and how you could strengthen your home. We're also, all the partners are also working with ARP. So here, on 4 successive Saturdays, June 4th, hurricanes, how bad can it get? I believe John will be speaking at that one. June 11th, build your disaster plan. June 18th, prepare your home for a hurricane. And June 25th, prepare for a hurricane. What to do if you live in a high rise, okay? Again, you need to register for these, but they're all available for the public. There are also some emergency fairs we want you to know about. This is the Maui Emergency Preparedness Fair at the Queen Hamanu Center, June 4th from 10 to 2 p.m. And all of the fairs and webinars are summarized on this flyer. We've created a package that's available for the press that have all the education and outreach available for the public. Two fairs that we that don't have flyers but are on this summary flyer are one, there's a Waipahu, Waikele Health and Safety Fair, June 11th from 9:30 to 3 p.m. And then there's Aina Haina Prepared on June 25th, that's at Kahala Mall from 10 to 2 p.m. Closing remark, we really encourage people to prepare not just for the short term, but for the long term. When you do things to retrofit your house, you're protecting your house not only for this hurricane season, but for the hurricane season 10 years from now, regardless of the weather conditions. And the best time to prepare is now. Actually, the best time to prepare is off hurricane season, because if you're going to retrofit your house, it'll take you 2 months to line up a contractor, and you cannot do it when there's a hurricane watch or warning coming in. Okay, so prepare now. Everyone should be proactive, and there's a lot of education and outreach. We hope the media could help us spread the word. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. And next, I'd like to invite Chris Bursley up to talk about the hurricane season outlook.
Aloha. Good to see everybody again here in person. It's been a long time. Thank you to John for overseeing the press conference, putting it together, the logistics. Thank you to Luke. Thank you to Dennis. Thanks to Kevin for their messages, especially the best time to prepare. The best time to prepare is yesterday. The next best time is today. So hopefully we're able to get those messages out. And today, we've heard from just some of our government organizations that are working together to build community resilience. We here at NOAA's National Weather Service proud to work together as a team with these groups in our local communities. And the aim is to get the message out, get information, vital information to the public so that they can be prepared and ready for a possible hurricane. And mahalo to our media partners for their support in getting that message out to the community and building NOAA's Weather Ready Nation initiative here in the state of Hawaii. The seasonal hurricane outlook is developed by NOAA's National Weather Service Central Pacific Hurricane Center in coordination with the Climate Prediction Center. A team of the nation's leading climate scientists use an expanding array of observational data and computational horsepower to be able to run models that will help us predict how the global circulation pattern will evolve. Using that information, we can search for areas where we think there may be drought or flood, hot or cold temperatures, and what our hurricane activity levels will be. So in 2021, as you can see there on the chart, the outlook was for below normal hurricane activity in the Central Pacific. And that, in fact, turned out to be the case. We had a single verified tropical cyclone in our area. Even though it was pretty quiet, we did have one notable exception where the remnants of former Hurricane Linda moved into the state last summer, gave us some rainfall and some gusty winds as it moved through the state. So even with a quiet year, there's always a possibility of getting some activity. But overall, it has been quiet for the past several years. If we go to the next slide, the sea surface temperatures, as Kevin alluded to, are cold, indicating La Nina, cold waters along the equator. And that is expected to continue through the rest of the year. Now, when we have a La Nina condition, it creates conditions over our area where we have a lot of frequent wind shear. Wind shear is something that hurricanes don't do well with. They tend to weaken significantly and tend to shear apart. We've seen this over the past several seasons where hurricanes have encountered that wind shear and have weakened dramatically. We expect that condition will continue in place this year. So, if we go to the next slide, the 2022 hurricane season outlook, we expect that we will most likely have below average tropical cyclone activity in the Central Pacific as a whole. The outlook is for 2 to 4 tropical cyclones. That includes tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes. It's important to note that the outlook doesn't necessarily pinpoint where those tropical cyclones might occur. It only takes one wandering into the vicinity of the state to cause a tremendous amount of potential impact. Even with quiet years, thinking back 2 years ago to Hurricane Douglas, which approached the state from the east and just barely missed us to the north. The impacts from that could have been very significant if we had seen a slight jog of that hurricane to the south. And of course, we're reminded on 2022 is the 30th anniversary for Hurricane Iniki, which made direct landfall on the island of Kauai as a major hurricane. Those residents who experienced the impacts from Hurricane Iniki still remember those experiences today. The incredible destructive power that it brought to their island. So throughout the state, we must remain aware that there's the possibility of a hurricane, and that's a real possibility each and every hurricane season, regardless of the outlook. So we should heed advice of our public safety officials, preparedness messages that you've heard today. Make a preparedness plan and communicate it to your friends and family. Together we can do these things and make our communities more ready for any impacts that could come. Thank you for your attention. Turn it to John.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Kevin. All the speakers will be available for questions. For those of us who are joining us virtually, take this chance now. If you have any questions to ask, type those into the Q&A box. They'll pop up here, and we'll read them off to the group and have the speakers answer them. While we're waiting for that to happen, we'll go around the room and see if there's anybody here who has a question for any of our speakers.
For you, I guess, how does this compare to last season's outlook, and how good was last season's?
Oh, take it. This, we're actually slightly lower. Last year, we were forecasting 2 to 5 tropical cyclones. We edged back towards neutral and then went to La Nina again, so we were wondering if you'd be borderline near to below normal. This year, we're expecting more likely conditions being below normal, so the numbers wise 2 to 4. And like Chris mentioned, last year there was 1. So last year was a quiet season, and actually Jimeno was barely made it into the basin. It weakened to a remnant just as it came across. So last year extremely quiet, and this year below normal activity. But even though it's not active, we're not expecting to be active. Like we mentioned 2 years ago, we had 2 in 2020. Douglas was a pretty significant threat to us.
You mentioned the La Nina dry conditions. I mean, last year was really catastrophic, especially on the Big Island, Maui even recently. I mean, what can we expect in terms of, wildfire risk, and is that going to get worse heading into the summer?
Yeah, it's, I think that the conditions are just going to get drier and drier. So the areas that currently have drought, this is going to expand and intensify. I mean, you go out there in the leeward areas, it's already pretty crispy in some areas, and we're seeing some ignitions. I think in Maui County had some set already, and so that's just going to get worse as time goes on. I mean, we haven't hit peak heat yet in the warmth, and then it's just going to, the leeward dryness is just going to expand over time, and as we get into this heart of the summer months, and so I would anticipate the fire risk increasing.
And is that just part of La Nina, or is that overall the trend with climate change as well, like having the drier conditions for good?
No, it's just part of the La Nina trend, and we're going to have just projected drier than normal conditions. And you look at the projection for sea surface temperatures around the islands, it's looking like it's going to be cooler than average, so that might have a reduction in the amount of rainfall as well. One thing I didn't mention too is that for windward sides of the state, even though we might have persistent trade winds, and you'd say, hey, we should get continued trade wind showers, the way that drought manifests itself on the windward slopes is that you may have the normal number of days with rain, measurable rain, but the amount of rain per day can be substantially reduced. So even half the amount of rain that you would normally expect on the windward sides. So even the windward sides can see some dryness and even some potential increased risk for wildfires in those areas as well. Since I'm up here, any other rain-related questions? So I don't have to get my reps up back and forth.
Actually, Kevin, there's a question that came in through the webinar. How rare are 3 La Nina years in a row?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I didn't mention that, but in the last 50 years, we have only had two other times where we've had three La Niñas in a row, back in the early 70s and then again in the late 90s into the early 2000s. So this is a fairly rare occurrence, so we'll see what happens. Anything else?
There is one more question that came in through the webinar about the East Pacific outlook. Excuse me, about the East Pacific outlook. The East Pacific and Atlantic outlooks will be released on next Tuesday, May 24th. That'll be something scheduled happening on the East Coast, I think 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, so bright and early here. But you can look for those two outlooks for the Atlantic Basin and for the East Pacific Basins next Tuesday.
That being said, this outlook includes any that might come from the East Pacific, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, so the outlook for activity that we're talking about for the Central Pacific is looking at the area between 140 West and the International Dateline. That's what we consider, that's our area of responsibility at the Central Pacific Hurricane Center. And most of our activity occurs, forms in the East Pacific and moves in, crosses 140 into our basin. Recent averages, it seems like it's about one per year that we have a tropical cyclone that develops in the Central Pacific, but an average year for us is about 4 to 5. So the outlook of 2 to 4 is just looking at below normal. Anything more? Oh, okay.
This might be for Luke or Dennis. How prepared are we for an actual hurricane, especially just given, even with the Kona lows last year, all the devastation that we saw just from that, even with not a full-blown hurricane?
It's a good question. The last couple of years, I think the resilience of Hawaii has been tested. You go back to 2018, we've had a lot of different disasters in the state. One of the big points, and you've heard it a little bit here today, we haven't had a lot of direct hits from hurricanes. If you look at Hurricane Lane and even the tropical system Olivia that we had the last couple of years, we tend to flood a lot. I think that we've shown some real resiliency on Kauai and some of the outer islands, even here on Oahu, with the heavy rain events. So I do believe that we need our neighbors helping neighbors and to be prepared. And we need the government and our other partners to be ready when we have an incident.
Kevin, we do have a couple more. Came in over the webinar for you. One of them is it safe to assume that with the dry soil and dry conditions, we could have more flooding problems, like in because of the runoff?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe in some areas we could and it just all depends on how intense the rainfall will be. I think of particular concern is the area on the Big Island, South Kohala District, where they have the Mana Road fire scar. So places like that would have a greater risk for faster flash flooding. But outside of that, not anticipating anything really different.
And then another question about the Big Island, is the Kona wet season on track for their on the Kona side?
Yeah, one thing about the Kona slopes is that it's unique in the state of Hawaii, where it's the only leeward side of the state that actually has a summertime wet season. And I would anticipate that this summer the Kona slopes should get their rainfall back, but we'll see how much occurs. If with the sea surface temperatures not being excessively warm, I would expect that they would get more of a normal type of wet season, but we'll see what happens. There's some with the end of the eruption that may have had a role too in helping increase rainfall on the Kona side as well. The last few summers have been pretty wet, and in fact too wet, and depending on who you ask. But so that also plays a role. So I would anticipate Kona slopes having a wet season like they normally would for the summertime. That it? All right.